You're listening to the Pursuit Podcast. I'm your host, Jessica Rose. For the past stretch, we've been talking to people about different aspects of learning something new. Most folks deciding to talk about learning to code. Today, we've got a very special guest who's going to talk to us about how to learn and how to share the knowledge of those fundamental computer science principles many of us may have missed out on. I'm here today with...
Hi, I'm Vaidehi, and I am a software engineer, and I'm also an author, and I am also the co-host of the BaseCS podcast and creator of the BaseCS series.
So today we're going to be talking about learning more than just code, sort of getting back to computer science basics. Just to get started, tell me a little bit about BaseCS.
Sure, yeah. BaseCS is it started off as a written series, and it was kind of like one of these projects that I decided I was going to do just to push myself to do something I'm uncomfortable with and to kind of push myself out of my comfort zone. So I decided I was going to teach myself some sort of computer science concept every week for a year, and I was going to write about it. And I've done weekly writing projects before. So it started off as kind of like a weekly blog series, and then it kind of snowballed into a little bit of a community, and then there was a podcast that came from it, and more recently there's been video series. But the basic idea of it is creating fun, friendly, approachable resources to learn computer science, which is, in my experience, something that's a little bit hard to find in CS in general.
Because there's a lot of resources for learn this framework or learn to code or learn this new language, but there's not as much out there for sort of computer science fundamentals.
Yeah, totally. And especially for people who don't come from a computer science background or the world of software or with, any previous experience, people who are completely new and who are I don't know anything about this, but I'd like to learn.
So what was the outcome for you? You said, I'm going to go ahead and learn and write about a new concept once per week. And then there seems to be a lot of project-based output that you're writing and running a podcast and doing everything, it sounds like. But how did it work for your own learning and development?
Oh, well, I think not to sound too cliche, but I think it kind of made me fall in love with code again, because a lot of the stuff that I started learning about was stuff that I had already been interacting with and using day to day on my job, but I never knew what was actually happening. And it was kind of I suddenly was pulling back the curtain on things that I was leaning on to create things and to write code and to build software, and I had never known. And it was seeing it in a whole different light. And I think that was probably the biggest impact and change in my own personal and professional development, I think.
So a lot of sort of hand to the forehead moments, oh, that's what that's been doing.
Yeah, exactly. I had a lot of those, and that was really cool. It made me kind of appreciate it in a whole different sense.
So if you were having a conversation with somebody who is just getting started in technology, maybe they've come from a different background, or maybe they're youngins who want to get into tech, how would you pitch digging in and learning some computer science fundamentals to them?
I think personally, the most fun way is actually the most organic. And it's the one that ends up having a more profound impact on how you learn something. And when I say the most organic, what I mean is kind of stumbling upon something naturally rather than hitting your head on the book and trying to be I want to understand what this is. Why don't I understand? It's probably because you don't have the context or the mental model to understand something. So I guess my advice would probably be to try to go a little bit off the happy path of whatever it is that you're doing. And maybe that means you're working with a framework or a library and you're comfortable in it, but you've never actually looked at the source code. So maybe try looking at that and seeing if there's something there that you don't quite know, or maybe there's a computer science term or something you've never heard of in that source code. And then that's a really good way of sinking your teeth into it, because it can be hard to know where to start. And the world of computer science is so massive, and it's how do I learn all these things? Well, you got to pick one thing and just start from there. And it's really good if it's already something you're interested in, or you've already tried out, or something you're slightly familiar with. And then just going a little bit off the happy path and seeing how you can get out of your comfort zone of what you don't know.
So that's a really fantastic idea. Look at what you're already working with, look at what already exists, and then start digging in a bit deeper. Say like, well, I've been doing this for a while. Why do I do this? What's the sort of function behind it?
Yeah, totally. I think that's a great way of learning pretty much anything. And it's just a good educational tactic. But I think with things that are kind of daunting and intimidating, like computer science, it's a way of lowering the barrier to entry for it, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense to me. So you said that you've had a bit of a community develop around what you've been writing and then podcasting and now videos. What kinds of challenges, what kinds of things do you see people wanting to learn about coming out of your community?
Oh, that's a good question. I think there's a strong desire of, part of it is like, I want to be able to implement this and like maybe create something that I've seen on a concept level and be able to like write it on my own in code. There's a strong desire to be like, how do I actually do this on my own? And how do I actually write the code version of this? Which BaseCS hasn't really gotten into yet, but that's something I want to kind of take the community into in the future. Another thing that's really interesting is that there are a lot of people who kind of got exposed to concepts because they'd go into like technical interviews, or they would watch videos and be like, oh, I need to know this thing because it's probably going to come up when I interview for this job. But there's a lot of disparity between learning something and understanding the practical applications. There's one aspect of, I know how this works, but the other aspect is, why should I care? And I think what's really interesting about BaseCS readers and podcast listeners, a lot of them might have either known about it or heard about it, but they never knew why it matters. And then that kind of goes back to the idea of abstractions, where when you see it being used in things you already know, that's when you have that light bulb moment. And there's like a strong desire to understand, why should I know this? And so I try to do a really good job of like showing the history of why something existed or why people started using something or where it's used on a practical level to make it more clear, like why it matters. Because abstractions can be a little tricky where you're like, I don't have to think about it, so why should I care about how something works?
I find it really interesting that a lot of your community members are coming in to ask questions and to learn about things coming out of technical interviews or coming out of having watched a video. Is there a way that you've found either yourself or you've heard of your learners using to keep track of these? Is something like a journal, or is writing your own blog posts sort of recommended practice here?
I definitely think that there are a few people who have kind of taken the blog post thing and ran with it, which is really cool to see. I've seen a couple of posts where people will listen to the BaseCS podcast and then they'll read the post and then they'll be like, oh, this is cool. I'm going to try to implement it in Python because that's the language I'm learning. And I'm maybe new to coding or something like that. So I think that's something that I've seen before. I don't know about the journaling thing. That would be really interesting. I probably should reach out and see if people are doing that, especially like something like sketch notes or illustrated versions of concepts, because with the written version of BaseCS, there's a lot of illustrations that go with it that I create. And it would be really cool if people do that. And I just don't know if they are. I should probably find out.
We're big fans of sketch notes here on the podcast. So yeah, it'd be really cool to see what people are making.
Yeah, totally.
I think it's really interesting that you have content across a lot of different mediums. You've got written content, you've got audio, and you've got video coming out now. Was this part of a deliberate move towards making material accessible for different learner needs?
Yes, it totally was. But I will point out that I did not know that any of it was going to happen. It happened as more people started reading the series, and I started realizing that the written version, while it does make an effort to include a lot of populations that probably aren't benefiting from the CS content and resources that are out there, it does leave a lot of people out. And it's exactly for the reason that you pointed out, which is that people learn differently. I started picking up on that. And I used to also be, before I got into software, I used to be a teacher. And so I'm a little bit familiar with kinesthetic versus auditory versus visual learners. So as I started getting deeper and deeper into computer science concepts, I realized that they get more complex. And I was like, it took me like 2 weeks to learn this idea. I could write a blog post, but it might not actually sink in for everybody because this is kind of tricky stuff. So you have to be able to present it in different ways. And honestly, I think part of the reason that computer science programs for undergrads and master's programs, and even people who are just like taking an online course, part of the reason that it's not always effective is because they sometimes assume that everybody learns this concept in the same way. And I don't know. I think that's a little bit of a issue that's across the board with education, where not everyone's going to have that light bulb moment based on one way that you present it. And so that is a reason that I'm trying to take the visual content, turn it into something that can also be accessible for people who learn in an auditory way. And also the videos are like the process of seeing me do something and kind of illustrate it out, I'm hoping will help kinesthetic learners. Down the road, I'd really like to do something that lets people do something more interactive, like maybe writing code and actually seeing it run and seeing how the code that they write can build a data structure, or how they can tweak an algorithm and understand how it works by actually doing it themselves. So what you said is totally correct, that it is a very intentional thing, because that is something that's a huge void, not just in education, but in computer science specifically.
Well, it's also really helpful for people who have different accessibility needs. So just last week we had on Kit, who's a tech journalist and a accessibility technology specialist. And she had talked a bit about her learning pathways. Mm-hmm. And one thing she talked about is being largely unable to see, that learning technical concepts was often really difficult because very few people built all audio technical resources. I thought it was really fantastic that BaseCS had a podcast working through and teaching you via an all audio format.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because I do think the podcast does a really good job of helping out folks who learn in an auditory way, or who might not be able to see as well, or who just can't sit and read a 3,000-word blog post because they don't learn like that. But it's also interesting to see how some people will use all three formats at the same time in order to compound on their learning and build upon it. And it only helps reinforce those ideas. So I think it kind of has a twofold aspect to it, where it can be something that you can build upon your foundation, but it also can be something that can open up the door in terms of, as you said, technical concepts taught in an audio format. It's just not something you really see. It's not something I have been able to see, especially for something that's like a fundamental thing versus something that's more nuanced and niche.
So throughout your experience building first this written content and the podcast and the videos, is there one computer science concept that most people think they know that really deep down they don't know?
That's a very good question. I think I can't speak to some of the more very complex things, because I think most people will tell you that they don't know it. They'll be like, I don't know what Dijkstra's shortest path algorithm is. I've heard about it, but I don't really know it. But I think very fundamental data structures, and even just like binary, there are a lot of people who are like, oh yeah, it's just ones and zeros. I know it. And then they might not know the history of where it comes from, or they might not know why a bit is called a bit, or why 8 bits in a byte matters. There are reasons and like very intentional things that happened in history that caused those numbers and those choices to proliferate throughout software. But a lot of people will be like, oh, I know that. And then they'll listen to the podcast or they'll read the thing and be like, wow, I've been doing this for 25 years and I did not know that, which is always really cool to see. It's very simple things, that very, very fundamental concepts that sometimes are not explored as much because people sometimes might think they're too simple, or maybe nobody's done a good job of explaining why the simple things were created the way they were.
So you mentioned veterans coming in and occasionally be like, wow, I never stopped to think about X. Would you have any messages for folks who've been in computer science a while to try and push them, to encourage them to sort of dig into maybe some of the fundamentals they didn't catch the first time around, or something that didn't sink in that lecture hall 15 years ago?
I don't know if I would have necessarily, I don't know if it's advice. Sometimes I'm like, I don't know if I'm qualified to give somebody advice who actually has a CS degree and I don't. But I guess I would always encourage people to go back to the basics, because even if you've been doing it for a long time, being able to refresh the basics and understand really, really fundamental things is so important, because part of it is it establishes your understanding of the things you do every day and frameworks and libraries and the software that you write. But on a different level, it helps you see things as a beginner again. And I think that's really important for people who have been in the industry for a while, for the veterans in our field especially, because they are the ones who will sometimes become very removed from very, very basic concepts. And then when they meet somebody who is newer, it can be very, very hard to put yourself in the shoes of somebody who's new, because not for any fault of your own. It's just like, it's been a while since I've been that new. And I think being able to return to the fundamentals and the basics and refresh them or revisit them through the eyes of a beginner helps you empathize with people who are seeing it for the first time versus you who've seen it maybe a couple times in the past 2 or 3 decades. It helps you put yourself in the shoes of that person, which is, I think, really important when we start talking about including people in our field who come from non-traditional backgrounds or who are underrepresented groups.
That's fantastic. So not only might you learn something that you missed the first time or get a valuable refresher, but it's almost an inoculation against getting too obnoxious with your expert bias.
Yeah, totally.
What computer science concept did you enjoy learning about the most?
Oh my gosh, that's a hard question. There's so many.
Like, they're just all so cool.
Yeah, really, they are. I think probably some of the algorithms were very, very cool to learn because I would start digging into the source code of, for example, like JavaScript. And I would look at how very, very simple functions that, I mean, they were simple to me in that I use them all the time, but I would look at how they were actually working. And then I'd be like, oh, they're actually using quicksort. That's actually very complicated. And I just learned about it, but that's what I use every day, which was very cool to see. But I really, really enjoyed learning about the parts of compilers and how, that's like a newer thing. Like I kind of got to that towards the end of the series, and I'm still kind of riding that wave and like learning about compilers on a deeper level now, even though I'm not writing every week.
We have very different definitions of fundamentals.
Why do you say that?
You're like, the fundamentals, like algorithms and how compilers work. I'd be like, wait, one of these things doesn't quite belong.
Well, I think I kind of got to compilers at the end of the year-long project, and I realized that compilers are really just data structures and algorithms smushed together. It's like data structures that are spit out by an algorithm that knows how to build a data structure in a very specific way based on the code that you type. So like you could probably unpack compilers even more, but it is just like little pieces that have been put together, and it kind of seems scary because you're like, oh my God, it's a compiler. What does that mean? But if you unpack the little moving parts of it, which is what I started doing through BaseCS, and I hopefully will continue doing, you start to realize, oh wait, a compiler is just a program. It's a program that uses these data structures that I already know, and it uses the data structures and manipulates them with specific algorithms. And then you're like, okay, I've learned algorithms. I've learned data structures. This is very different, but I'm kind of working with the same tools, even though it feels like unfamiliar territory. And I think that's why starting with the basics and working your way up helps you build confidence, because then you're like, I've learned how a tree works and I've learned how to traverse it. And so now I just need to figure out how to reframe my mental model to understand what type of tree is inside of a compiler. Or in the case of most compilers, it's abstract syntax trees, which is just a type of tree, which if you understand how a tree works, then you're like, okay, I understand the fundamentals. Now I just need to reframe how I think about this. But compilers were probably my favorite. And I only got to them at the end and I was like, what? My mind is blown. This is a whole new world. But I think those are really cool.
So what you're telling me is that if I go back and really, really dig into the basics, I've got the opportunity to approach things that seem like arcane black magic, for example, how compilers are actually working, and do it with sort of a newfound sense of this is all going to be okay?
Yes, very much so. I totally believe that. Because even the super complex things are actually just the basics, like the building blocks of the basics built upon one another. And I think that goes back to the point of it is important to know the basics because on a day-to-day level, you probably are working with abstractions and black magic and black boxes that are abstracting away things that you don't need to think about, which is fine. And I think abstractions are very good. And it's good that you and I don't have to think about how compilers work every day, because then we'd probably, every time we type something, we'd be like, oh my God, look at all the things that are happening. And we just never type anything because we'd be amazed.
Paralyzed by it.
Exactly. But I do think that if you stumble upon it organically, or if you're interested, or somehow you're forced to confront that, it becomes easier to confront it and come face to face with those scary black magic abstractions if you just remember, hey, all of this at the end of the day has to be the fundamentals. I know it has to be because it can't be anything else. So then I need to go back and understand the fundamentals, or remind myself if I already know them to begin with. Then it's like, rather than seeing this big black box of scary things, it's actually, okay, this is going to be like little pieces of things, and I'm going to know some of them. And then wherever there's gaps in my knowledge, I got to go in and fill those in and figure out what's happening. And maybe I don't actually need to know all of them right now. Let me just figure out how 4 of them work. And then I'll worry about the other 75 later. Or over time, I'll start to understand the other 75 things that I don't know, and I'll start to see it in a new light. Most of us don't know how compilers work fully, and we don't need to. But there might come a time where we need to know how a little bit of it works. And then if you know that it's a basic concept somewhere deep down, you can break it down and understand that.
So these tiny pieces of fundamentals, these things we're learning along the way, these things we should probably go investigate, are a little bit about like learning spell components that unlock these big mysterious things.
Yeah. I'm unfamiliar with what a spell component is.
Oh, I'm mostly thinking Harry Potter style.
Oh, right. Yes, I am familiar with that.
So this has all been fantastic. What are you going to do next? Are you going to stick with making some more material for BaseCS? Have you got a big, exciting new project? Or are you going to take some well-deserved downtime to puzzle out what exactly compilers are doing all the time?
Well, I am going to continue with the BaseCS podcast and the videos, and that's kind of going to be an ongoing thing because there is so much content that still needs to be recalibrated to be accessible to everyone. So that's something that's going to continue. But something else I'm working on is creating a BaseCS book, because there's a lot of people who would like.
How exciting!
Yeah, it's exciting and also nerve-wracking. Somehow the idea of putting it down on paper seems scary. They're putting it like out on the internet in form of blog post. I don't know why the paper part scares me, but I'm doing it. So that's something that I'm going to be working on this year. But also, I think going forward in the future, kind of to address the gaps in the current version of BaseCS, I'd like to do things that are a bit more implementation based. And part of that is going to be like, how does a compiler work? How do you write an interpreter? How do you parse something, and what does that mean? And those are concepts that are trickier, which means you can't really create a blog post on it in a week, because it actually involves combining fundamental concepts to build up to something that's bigger. And hopefully that's something that I'm going to try to do throughout this year, is like not write as often, but create things that are building blocks of the fundamentals with compilers specifically, because there's a whole world of knowledge there that is a step above computer science fundamentals. It's not quite data structures and algorithms, it's a little bit harder. So it's like kind of graduating from the kindergarten of BaseCS to like second grade.
Could you give us sort of a quick explainer of one of your favorite concepts you've talked about in your writing or in your blog posts? Just a quick TLDR of how this or how that works.
So there is a command in Git called git bisect. And it's something that I was introduced to maybe like a year or so ago. And people will often use it for debugging when in a Git history or on a branch, something went terribly wrong. So people will use git bisect and they'll be like, okay, I know that this commit is good and I know this commit is bad. And somewhere along the way, we push something very, very terrible. So how do we figure out what it is? And it turns out that git bisect actually uses an algorithm called binary search. And binary search is something that's usually taught with something called a binary search tree. But the concept itself is pretty cool. So the idea is that if I tell you that I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 100, you could pick any number and just try to guess, right? Or you could ask me like, is it bigger or is it less than the number 50? And if I say it's less than, you've suddenly eliminated all the numbers between 50 and 100, and you've narrowed down the things you have to search through and the amount of time it's going to take you to search. So the binary search algorithm is basically something that is logarithmic, which means that it's kind of like the opposite of exponential, where every single time, whenever you run binary search, you're like, okay, is it bigger or less than the number in the middle? And every single time you narrow down. And binary search is used in software and computer science quite a bit. But what's really cool is Git bisect uses that. So when you're like, oh, here are 20 commits, I'm going to look at the fifth one and I'm going to ask the person, like the computer, or I guess Git, is like, I'm going to ask you, is this commit good or bad? And if you say it's bad, then then the computer knows, oh, okay, I need to search through this half of your Git history. And it uses binary search to narrow it down, which is very cool, but you don't know it when you're necessarily using Git bisect. You're like, all right, I'm just going to go through. But it's using this algorithm under the hood, which is actually not that hard when you start thinking about what it's doing, but it can seem kind of intimidating because the name kind of sounds scary, I think.
Very exciting. So anytime you're using Git bisect, you're playing an invisible silent game of 20 questions with potentially 20,000 questions.
It is totally 20 questions. Yes, you're right.
You've been such a fantastic guest. If our dear listener wants to find you on the web or check out your podcast, where should they look?
Our podcast is available on iTunes and elsewhere. I guess most places that you would find podcasts. Also, you can listen to it online at codenewbie.org/BaseCS. And you can find the written BaseCS series at medium.com/BaseCS. And you can follow me on dev2/Vaidehi Joshi for all of the video series, which is produced in collaboration with the Practical Developer. Or you could just follow me on Twitter because I post about all three of these things all the time. My handle is @Vaidehi Joshi.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun.
And thank you so much for listening. That's it for this week on the Pursuit Podcast. If you join us again next week, we're going to be taking our last look at learning new things. We're going to be talking to someone who is a self-taught developer about how they learned and how they got through that hard slog of getting that first job. We hope to see you then.